Hello my friends, my name is Mark David Welsh, I'm an author and publisher, and welcome to my roundup of what I've been reading in January 2020. Now we're going to start with something very serious this month. The word classic, when applied to literature, usually refers to something written in the Victorian or Edwardian periods and usually by an English author. Now this next book doesn't tick any of those boxes at all. It was written in 1929 by a German, but it's certainly a classic in every other sense of the word. All Quiet on the Western Front by Erich Remarque is the first-person narration of a young German soldier in the trenches of the First World War. It's a devastating read, not only for the vivid passages of horror, bloodshed and violence, but just as much for the almost banal details of the troops' day-to-day lives when they're a few miles away from the front. There's a real sense of death and despair in these pages, and not just the imminent threat of physical extinction that surrounds them on all sides at every moment, but the tangible sense that their lives are over, whatever happens. They came to the war straight from school, so they have no job or adult life to go back to, and even if they do make it back alive, their sense of self and their souls can never return with them. They've been buried in the earth in which they lie, tangled in the barbed wire, or lost somewhere out on no man's land. It's no surprise to find out that Remarque served on the front in the First World War because of the level of detail here and the emotional insights he provides. At times the book is poetic and beautiful, at others visceral and heartbreaking. I can't say it was exactly an enjoyable experience to read it, but it is one of the finest literary works that I've read in a long time. Now, for a far more conventional example of classic literature, we go to Castle of the Carpathians, the 1892 novel by Jules Verne. Now, I'm slowly going through Verne's entire fictional back catalogue, which is quite a task considering the guy wrote over 60 novels and many shorter pieces. Now, I have been doing this in order of publication, but I skipped ahead quite a few books to read this one because I wanted to blog about the 1981 Czechoslovakian film version. Now, I don't always go back to the source material for all the films I blog about because that would take ages. But if the book's to hand, then why not? Especially if it informs the review that I make of the film. Now, the first and most obvious place to start with this novel is that it's very short by Julie's standards. And I call him Julie because we're best buds now after I've read 25, 30 of his books. You see, but this one is only 18 chapters. And given the slow opening with the usual wealth of encyclopedic detail concerning the region, its peoples and customs, and the fact that the main protagonist doesn't even appear until about halfway through, I can't help but think this was originally intended as a much longer work. Perhaps he simply lost interest in it, as I confess I did pretty quickly. There's also a regrettable couple of paragraphs about the Jewish people. Julie really did seem fixated on this image of Jews as greedy moneylenders. Off on a Comet, which was published a few years earlier, particularly contained some seriously racist content on this subject, and although he seemed to straighten up and fly right afterwards, mainly because of complaints made about that book at the time, he's regressed a little bit here. Sidebar: why did the Jews become moneylenders in the first place? Well, simply put, there was an opening in that job market. Christians weren't supposed to do it. The Catholic Church never forbade a Christian from taking up the profession, but they did actively discourage it. And because the population was so enthralled to the church back then, no one dared go against it. Why? Why were they so against Christians going into it? Well, probably because they didn't want anyone getting as rich as they were. As for the film of the book, well, great production design with some very inventive and interesting contraptions, which reminded me a little bit of something Wallace and Gromit might come up with. But there's lots of opera in it and quite a broad vein of juvenile humour, which I couldn't really take to. So, pretty much like the book, it's one for Verne completists only. Now, next on the list is I Didn't Get Where I Am Today, the autobiography of the late British comedy writer David Nobbs, which was published in 2003. Now, as Nobbs points out early on in this, he can't imagine why anyone would want to read about the life of someone who spent most of his time sitting around on his arse in front of a typewriter trying to come up with something funny. And that's a valid point, of course, but Nobbs' reflections on his life are warm, human, funny and self-deprecating in all the best ways, just as his fiction is, so it's a highly enjoyable read. And it's also contained some interesting information. I had no idea that he began his career as a gag man in the 1960s British TV satire boom, providing jokes for shows like That Was the Week That Was and The Frost Report. He also crossed paths with some of the comedy giants of the era, the Pythons, Peter Cook, Frankie Howerd, Ken Dodd, Les Dawson and the Two Runners, and he wrote sketches for a lot of those people, although not the Pythons obviously, although he wanted to. His breakout success was with his iconic TV show The Fall and Rise of Reginald Perrin, which was based on his novel The Life and Death of Reginald Perrin, which is without question the funniest book that I've ever read. Now, another thing I didn't know about was that the star of the TV show, Leonard Rossiter, refused to work on subsequent series unless Nobbs wrote them as novels first and then adapted them into scripts. Now, the fact that I've read all of Nobbs' fiction meant I put this book down with a heavy heart, because I'll miss spending time in his literary company. However, I had failed to appreciate that he wrote quite a few other TV shows that I've never seen. I kind of remember them being on at the time, but I never watched them because I didn't appreciate that the writer of Reginald Perrin was involved. So there's still some more of his work for me to check out, albeit in a different medium. Now, if you've watched my previous roundup video, you'll know that I like to try a new hard-boiled crime author every month, and this month it's a guy called Raoul Whitfield and his most famous work, Green Ice, that was published in 1930. It was one of only 3 that he wrote, along with some short stories. And this tale of organised crime, ex-cons, missing emeralds and murder is packed with incident and action. So much so, in fact, that if it was a modern publication, I'd suspect it of being a spoof or a satire. I mean, our hero is only minutes out of the pen when he's met by an ex-girlfriend, and a few minutes later, she's dead. Next, he goes to visit an ex-cellmate, but that bird gets gunned down on the steps of a boarding house as our hero pulls up in a cab. And so it goes. Almost everyone he meets over the first half of the book ends up full of holes, in a plot so convoluted that the hero periodically has to stop, take a breath, sum it up to keep us all up to speed. Now, I couldn't find any biographical information on Whitfield or this work, but I suspect the explanation for this whirlwind of murder and mayhem is what we have here is several previously published short stories worked together into a novel. Now, in case you're not aware, that's exactly how Raymond Chandler came up with The Big Sleep, combining several stories he'd already had published in Black Mask magazine. He also reinvented his private detective Johnny Dalmas from those stories as the more charismatic Philip Marlowe. And if you want to read those original tales, they are actually available in a couple of volumes, Smart Alec Kill and Trouble Is My Business. Now, this approach does obviously give a dense, thrill-packed narrative, but it does make plotting a little bit tricky. Famously, when shooting The Big Sleep in 1946, the filmmakers couldn't work out who had killed the chauffeur, so they got in touch with Chandler to ask him, and he didn't know. So maybe this was Whitfield's approach with Green Ice. If so, he preempted Chandler's methodology by almost a decade. And the results are fairly seamless, and in fact I don't think the possibility would have occurred to me if I hadn't been aware of Chandler's technique. So Green Ice is a highly enjoyable read, with a real page-turning quality to it. There's a spare, bare-bones narrative style that I really admire, and my only criticism is that I don't think Whitfield ever manages to create a situation or characters that are really all that memorable. So for me it's a case of almost, but not quite. Talking of hard-boiled literature, this month's Mickey Spillane was The Flier, 2 novellas brought together in one volume and published in 1964. Now, as you may know, I'm a huge fan of Spillane's work, although obviously quite a few people find him too politically incorrect for their taste. Plotting and creative storylines were never really his forte, but I love his hard-as-nails, in-your-face style. It's blunt, vibrant, funny and immensely satisfying. In the Flier we have a war veteran finding out that an old buddy who died in a suspicious plane accident has left him an airfield in Miami. Now with Cuba just a short hop away, there's international intrigue afoot, and this gives Spillane plenty of opportunity to ride his favourite literary hobby horse, bashing the commies and the wet liberals in Washington who want to give them a fair hearing. Better not to wear red around Spillane, take my word for it. Now I actually preferred the second story in this short collection, The 7-Year Kill, even if it follows a very common Spillane formula. A man returns to his old life and gets caught up in the consequences of crimes both old and new. Now these stories are minor Spillane, sure, but I still found them extremely enjoyable. Next up we've got a couple of non-fiction reads, the first of which is Claude Rains, an actor's voice by David J. Skaal and Jessica Rains, which was published in 2008. Now I was really looking forward to this one because I've been a massive fan of Claude Rains' work for many years. In films such as Casablanca, obviously, The Adventures of Robin Hood, Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, The Wolfman, Hitchcock's Notorious, many others, and of course as the original Invisible Man in 1933. Now Rains had a very successful stage career indeed, was married 6 times and once woke up dead drunk beside the wreck of his burning car. Author Skaal wrote Hollywood Gothic, which is a masterful study of the early history of Bram Stoker's Dracula through the novel, the early stage versions and the first screen adaptations. And what's more, Skaal had access to a series of interviews that Rains gave in the 1960s for an abortive biography, and the cooperation of the actor's only daughter. So why didn't I enjoy this book more than I did? Well, there are some very interesting facts here. I mean, Rains was born on the wrong side of the tracks and had a serious speech impediment as a lad. A couple of things you would never believe if you watched him on the screen. His fine, rounded, modulated tones were his trademark. He was also acclaimed on the Broadway stage in the 1930s before he got into films, but he wasn't making much of a living because of the Great Depression, so he only went to Hollywood through financial necessity and nothing else. And he did once act on the stage in a play with 3 of his ex-wives. But all of that doesn't really illuminate the man, and somehow for me this biography never really caught fire. It's a decent read, but not one I'll probably go back to. In complete contrast to that, I loved Testimony, the autobiography of guitarist and songwriter Robbie Robertson, who found his greatest success in the 1960s with the band, who are now seen as one of the founding fathers of Americana music. I found Robertson's work to be really excellent and compulsive, as he details his teenage experiences playing with Ronnie Hawkins and the Hawks, forming the band, the group's evolution and career, right up to their farewell Last Waltz concert, which was filmed by one Martin Scorsese. It's also a fascinating snapshot of the 1960s, when casual drug use was simply a fact of life in music circles, like taking an aspirin for a headache or smoking a cigarette. Little thought was given to the consequences of such behaviour. So in a way it must have been a very liberating time, but obviously the casualty rate was extremely high. Now Robertson met and worked with many icons of the music world, most famously Bob Dylan on multiple occasions, but also Eric Clapton, Joni Mitchell, Ringo Starr and even Neil Diamond, to name a few. He even crossed paths with Jack Ruby, who booked the Hawks into his burned out nightclub in Fort Worth, Texas. Now in case you need reminding, Ruby was the guy who shot Lee Harvey Oswald and helped birth a million conspiracy theories about the assassination of John F. Kennedy. Now I have heard some criticism of Robertson over the years, and the fact that he exaggerates his importance within the band. And yet there are a few times, well more than a few times in fact in the book, where he does seem the group's smartest man in the room, both musically and otherwise. But obviously I've got no other sources to read to comment on that. All I can say is that this is a wonderful biography. It had me going back to it again and again. One criticism I do have, though, is it only covers his life up to that last waltz concert. And that is obviously the period that most people want to read about, including me, but he's made a lot of solo records since, working with Peter Gabriel and U2 and many others, as well as composing a lot of musical soundtracks for that guy, Martin Scorsese. So it would have been quite interesting to read about that and hear about his thoughts about his former bandmates and what happened to them after, including the reunion in which he did not participate and the sporadic occasions when he did work with some of them again. Perhaps that's coming in volume 2. I can only hope. Now it's back to fiction next, and here comes The Proteus Cure, the 2013 collaboration between F. Paul Wilson and Tracy L. Carbone. Now this is a medical thriller about a young widowed doctor who's working for a foundation that offer an innovative and highly effective new cancer treatment. But one day an ex-patient walks into her office with some strange symptoms, and her questions to the head of the practice fall on deaf ears. So she does a little solo investigation and starts to find out that some strange things are happening. Now, is she just being paranoid, or is there something about this miracle cure that people are desperate to keep secret? Now, medical thrillers aren't usually my thing, either in fiction or on the big screen, but with F. Paul Wilson's name on this one, I wasn't going to pass it by. Now, if you're not familiar with his work, he's best known as the creator of urban monster hunter Repairman Jack. And one day I'm going to read all those novels in a row and do a video on it just to bore you with it, because he is one of my favourite literary heroes. Now, I've read everything Wilson has written up until The Proteus Cure, but he's really prolific, so I'm quite a way behind, and if I can ever clear my massive TBR, his newer books are some of the first things I'm going to get hold of. So what's this one like? Well, it's very slick, very efficient, and almost begs to be turned into a movie. The presence of Carbone as co-author helps give us a highly relatable female protagonist. And if it is shorn of some of Wilson's wilder ideas and quirkier moments, it's still a book I looked forward to getting back to every night. Now, another read I enjoyed this month was The Tempest Tales, a group of interlinked short stories by Walter Mosley. Now, these tell the tale of black man Tempest Landry, gunned down in error on the streets of New York by the cops. When he gets to the pearly gates, St. Peter tells him to go to hell, but obviously he refuses on the grounds that he's not a sinner. So he's sent back to Earth to reconsider his position, accompanied by an angel who rather quickly finds out that he enjoys his human form a little too much. Now, the situation becomes more complicated when the devil shows up to join in their philosophical debates, which provides plenty of opportunity for Mosley to give us some social commentary. Now, if that sounds a little dry and boring, I can assure you it's not, because Mosley always has a fascinating point of view. And although this is not as memorable as his works about ex-con Socrates Fortlow, which are my favourites, or of private investigator Easy Rawlins, then it's still worth catching this if you're a fan of his work. Now, finally this month is the rather wonderful Rondo Hatton, Beauty Within the Brute, a 2019 biography of the iconic 40s horror actor by Scott Gallinghouse, Tim Weaver and others. Now, who was Rondo Hatton, you might ask? Well, you may not know the name, but you'll probably know the face. Rondo was originally a Tampa journalist who developed acromegaly, a disfiguring disease which is caused by a malfunction of the pituitary gland. Yes, Rondo was the universal horror monster who didn't need any makeup. Now, the main meat of this volume is Rondo's life story by Gallinghouse, although there are several other articles, essays and reproductions of documents included here which bring it up to full length. But it's the biography part which is the most interesting. Now, Rondo was only featured in a handful of Universal B pictures at the end of his career. So obviously Gallinghouse had quite a task in digging up the facts of Rondo's early Hollywood life, although he was a very prominent figure in his home city of Tampa. He'd been a college football star and played semi-pro baseball before becoming a popular journalist. And it's a measure of the man that he carried on with that reporting after he developed the disease, refusing to hide away from the world and meeting it head on instead. And what a terrible disease it is. Obviously the deformity of the head, face and hands is bad enough, but I had no idea how painful it was for him, how it made talking so difficult and caused so many other serious health issues. And towards the very end of his life, when he was starring in The Brute Man for Universal, it was even causing problems which would more closely be associated with dementia today. It's hard to comprehend what kind of struggle he had, so in some ways this is an upsetting read, but on the other hand it's a worthy tribute to a unique individual and an icon of horror cinema whose name and likeness live on, both in the movies and the annual Rondo Hatton Classic Film Awards. Well, that wraps it up for January. I'll be back next week with a video about something completely different, and in the meantime, friends, please don't be a stranger. Now, if you've been watching my videos, or if you saw my live, only one of them, we'll cut